Neutral is a place of no movement. It means you're not making progress towards the goals or the ideas that are really important to you. Welcome to Beyond Neutral, where we talk about what gets you stuck and how we can shift and navigate the road forward. As leaders, as professionals in our careers, or just balancing and creating the kind of life you desire. I'm your host, Paula Reed. Welcome to the podcast. Welcome to today's episode of Beyond Neutral. I'm your host, Paula Reed. So we have been talking over the last couple of episodes about the concept of agency, and agency being the recognition that you have control over your actions and your choices and the decisions that you make, and that you can impact all of those things, that's yours to control. And that's important to have, whether it's in your career or whether it's in your relationships or your life as a whole or your leadership, you name it. Agency is the key to being responsible for owning your situation, okay? And making choices to change it. So one of the things that can get in the way of that, of really having agency, is fear in general. But specifically, the fear I want to talk about today is the fear of failure. And so all of us have had at one point or another this little voice that, that scary little voice that's like, well, what if it doesn't work? Or what if you're not good at it? Or that can come up to bite us. Fear of failure can be actually a very paralyzing condition, a psychological condition that thankfully most people don't have in a massive way, but can be in such a way that it's actually paralyzing it. And you can self-sabotage, you can create behaviors that stop you from moving forward in any way. Luckily, most of us don't experience it at that level, but many of us have experienced it in one way or another, around a relationship, around a promotion, around a career change, around stepping forward and doing something different. Is often where that fear of failure comes in, raising your hand to take on a big project or whatever that may be. So I want to talk a little bit today about how do you handle that? How do you manage through a fear of failure if that's what you're facing? And the very first thing I would say about that is we don't often call it that, okay? It's very unusual that when you ask somebody, hey, well, what makes you nervous about this? What's causing anxiety? They don't say, I'm afraid I'm going to fail. Okay. Because we often can't even come to terms with that. That's really what our fear is. Okay. The fear that we may not be enough, right? That's basically what that's saying. So often it's couched in other ways. Oh, I may not have time to do this. This might not be the right timing for me. You name it. There's a million other things that we call it. So the very first thing I talk to all my clients about or work with all my clients on is you cannot solve a problem you can't name. Okay. Very hard to. And sometimes it takes work naming it. Okay. And I've had coaching clients like this where, all of a sudden a great assignment comes up at work and I can see them backing away from it as much as they want to advance their career. Well, I'm not sure that, this person who's involved in it is a good match for me. I'm not sure, I'm concerned about the timing of this because of what's happening with my kids. I'm concerned. And any decision that we make, obviously, and I am a big proponent of this, we make it for our whole lives. Like we don't make one change and have it affect only one part of us, right? All changes affect all parts of us. So I'm not suggesting that those things don't matter. What I am suggesting is quite often, that's not really where the concern lies. Where the concern really lies is fear of failing or fear of not succeeding. And so the first thing that I try to work with clients on is, what are you really afraid of? Let's get to this, okay? And how much time do you spend at work right now? Well, how much is this new assignment going to be? Really kind of start to chisel away at what it is you're concerned about. And then when you get right down to it, and you will get to the point where you can say, I'm afraid I might not be successful at this. I'm afraid I'm not up to the task. What I then dig in with clients on is, tell me what failure looks like for you and identify it. Really, what is really failure? And quite often, as you go down this path, I'll say, well, is it that you get fired? Is it that you had no idea you weren't doing a good job? Paint the story of what failure looks like. And in the case of one client, as they started painting this picture of what failure would look like, well, I would be given this assignment and I would miss a deadline. And because I missed the deadline, this would happen and that would happen and the next thing would happen. So we go through that whole thing. Okay, so that would be failure. And then where would you be as a result of that? Well, they would probably fire me. And I will go to the client and say, okay, let me ask you this. How many times in your career have you missed a deadline? Well, and inevitably it's like, well, I generally don't. And you go through, well, why don't you miss deadlines? Because I can do this and I do that and I do the next thing. Oh, okay. Well, how many times? And start really addressing those specific concerns, those specific fears, okay, around this worst case scenario, and dig in and analyze what are the skills that you have that would stop that from happening. Oh, well, when you start really thinking about the skills that you have that would stop that from happening, or the signs that you would see along the way, okay, or the conversations that you might engage if you sense that this was the direction that was going in, or the thing you might do if you kind of felt like you were a little bit over your head, who would you reach out to ask for help from? How would you manage that if you were over your head in it? And go down this road of what this presumed failure is, okay? And quite often, as you start to really give shape to this, it goes from being this, amoeba-like thing that seems overwhelming into being put into this little box. And once it's in that little box, you realize that there's so many elements of that little box that you can impact and that you can affect. And that the reason that this is being offered to you, the reason that you're in the position to consider this is because you have demonstrated along the way an ability to do exactly what they're asking you to do, or an ability to achieve exactly what this is asking you to achieve. Okay. So that is one direction to go in. And then I always ask clients, what would you learn? Let's go through that worst case scenario. What would you have learned through that process? And inevitably, people who are successful, and people who have succeeded, and everybody has stories of success, right? It's a question of where you're focusing to find them. You will find that in every situation, one of the things they gained from whether that was failing or whether that was succeeding was insight, was lessons, was information that they never had before they started that process. So by really defining and digging into what failure is, you kind of find out that failure really isn't, at the end of it, what you kind of imagined it was at the beginning, and the shape of it changes. So the very first thing is, in addressing it, is defining what it really is. What does it look like? Live in it, sit in it. How likely is it to happen? What are the skills you have to avoid that happening? Okay. The other way, the flip side, is to rethink about what success means. Okay, let's assume you do this. What would success look like? And always we knock it out of the park, right? Success would be, and it's over the top. Okay. Well, would you still be successful if you were 3/4 of the way to that picture that you painted? Well, yeah, that would be successful. Would you be successful if you were halfway there? Yeah, not as successful, but would you feel like it was worth doing had you done that? Yeah, I would feel like I was worth doing. You go through this scenario, okay? Go down this road, the road of success, the road of failure, whichever direction you want to take. And you really start to quantify these concepts that we start out with that are so overwhelming when we begin with them, that when we really start to dig into them, they're actually just pieces of information, pieces of milestones along the way, along the path to whatever the lesson or whatever the growth is or whatever the opportunity is or whatever you define success or failure as, you find out that they're all just steps along the road. And so often we get paralyzed by the big shape, the big concept of what it is. But the pieces that it takes to get there, the pieces that it takes to succeed, the pieces that it would actually take to fail, you realize are so unlikely because of how much you bring to any situation. That you just they lose their power by going down this road. By driving down this road, that big concept becomes a small concept and becomes tangible and manageable. And it becomes something that you have a much greater capacity to make a decision on out of information, a decision out of really an analysis of your skills and your desires and all those things that were kind of being put aside for this big fear that you had. So that is my tip of the day on how to have agency, another way to have agency and not allow fear, in this case, the fear of failing, and what that means and what that looks like, how to take that away and how to take that away as a roadblock so that you can go forward and make a decision based on real things, not based on what you imagine might happen, but in fact, based on real things that you do have control over. And I will give you one other tidbit to think about. There are people that I look at and I talk with them in coaching, or I talk with them in my search business, and I laugh around this because when they have these fears and they come up, one of the things I love to step back and think about is, do you actually know how not to succeed? And quite often, very few of us, very, very few of us don't know how not to succeed. Okay. By that, I mean, we find a way. We find a way to really harness the resources that we have, harness the capacity that we have, and succeed in some way. Define what that way is and decide to be with it. It's my thought of the day. I hope you're having a great week, and I hope you'll keep driving. That's it for today. Take care. Thanks so much for joining us on this week's episode of Beyond Neutral. Make sure to visit our website, www.reidandco.com, for this week's show notes. That's reidnco.com. And if you found value in today's episode, I would really appreciate you giving us a rating on Apple Podcasts, or better yet, share it with a friend. Also, don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. All of this helps to support the show. Thanks so much. Take care.